Welcome to the Iran This Week podcast with Art Keller for the week ending May 6, 2011. Let's start with a review of the news about Iran. On 1 May, the Washington Post reported that Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad led a cabinet meeting on Sunday and dismissed rumors of tensions with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Reports of a dispute between the two surfaced after Khamenei publicly overturned the president's April 19th decision to dismiss Iran's Minister of Intelligence, Haydar Moslehi. The minister, a cleric, did not attend the cabinet meeting, but had instead traveled to the Shiite Learning Center of Qom for discussions with leading ayatollahs, the semi-official Fars news agency reported. During the cabinet meeting, Ahmadinejad thanked the leader for his continuous support of the government and said that all government members are obedient to the supreme leader, Fars reported. The enemies and deviators should be sure that their efforts to create a rift will not have any results. Ahmadinejad faced unprecedented criticism from influential clerics, members of parliament, and other senior Iranian leaders for failing to promptly and publicly accept Khamenei's decision to reinstate the intelligence minister. The disapproval increased when Ahmadinejad stopped going to work 8 days ago, which led to rumors that he was about to resign over the supreme leader's intervention and charges that he was playing a game of political chicken. The two men have worked as close allies in the past, hardening Iran's stance on its controversial nuclear program and implementing a politically dangerous overhaul of the way state subsidies are distributed. After political activists calling for reform disputed Ahmadinejad's 2009 election victory, the supreme leader declared their parties illegal. In a recent speech, Khamenei lauded Ahmadinejad's government but said that he sometimes needed to step in when expediency was neglected. In Iran's political system, an elected president runs day-to-day affairs of the country together with the judiciary and the parliament. The supreme leader, in theory, has the power to veto decisions, but only does so publicly in rare cases. In the speech, Khamenei stressed that Moslehi's case was not of much importance and said there was no rift among Iran's leaders. He also advised the country's politicians to, quote, not help the commotion, unquote, caused by what he alleged were foreign propaganda machines. Despite those efforts, there was a flurry of public criticism aimed mainly at the president's advisor, Esfandiar Rahim Mashayi, who local media reported as being the instigator of the intelligence minister's dismissal. Mashayi is controversial for promoting Iranian culture over Islamic culture and is generally regarded as distant from the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Also on 1 May, the Washington Times reported a leaning Iranian dissident has killed himself in what appeared to be a final act of defiance against the Iranian regime that nearly ruined him. Farsi language websites reported over the weekend the death on Friday of Siamak Pourzand, an 80-year-old journalist and essayist who was one of his country's leading political and cultural writers before the 1979 revolution that later brought a theocratic regime to power. After the revolution, Mr. Pourzand became one of the main writers affiliated with Iran's domestic secular opposition in the 1990s. According to his children, Mr. Pourzand jumped from the 6th-floor balcony of his apartment in Tehran, where he had been under house arrest for the last 5 years. My father was a secularist, and he believed the culture of Iran needed to be safeguarded from the religious revolutionaries in 1979, said his daughter, Banafsheh Zand Bonazi, in a phone interview Sunday. So he stayed in Iran when he was given many opportunities to leave. He loved Iran and he gave his life for the freedom of his country. He leapt to his own death to prove his disgust for a regime that is inhumane and un-Iranian. On May 2nd, Reuters reported that the United States collaborated with Saudi Arabia to increase crude oil supplies to China at the expense of Iran, U.S. diplomatic cable show. The move was designed to hurt Iran and win Beijing support for sanctions against Iran over its nuclear program. China has long worried that oil supplies from Iran could be choked off if Beijing sides too closely with the West over Tehran's disputed nuclear activity. But as Saudi deliveries of crude increased to China over the past years, so has Beijing's support for UN sanctions against Tehran. Although Chinese state oil conglomerates have been moving into the vacuum created by the withdrawal of most major players from the Iranian oil patch. The cables, obtained by WikiLeaks, lay out how U.S. diplomats worked with Saudi Arabia and other big Middle Eastern oil suppliers to persuade Beijing to back tougher sanctions on Iran. Saudi Arabia and the United States discussed how increasing Saudi crude supplies to China would have the welcome side impact of reducing Iranian leverage over China, U.S. officials told the Saudi oil minister Ali al-Naimi in August 2009. 2 months earlier, a senior French diplomat overseeing Middle Eastern affairs told a U.S. embassy official that Saudi diplomats had told China, quote, "If you want oil from us, then you must put more pressure on Iran," unquote. For Saudi Arabia, increasing crude exports to China also made economic sense. Saudi oil sales to China were growing in response to increasing demand, and the kingdom wanted to diversify its customers just as China and many other countries wanted to diversify energy supplies and suppliers. Al-Naimi told U.S. officials, according to a cable dated August 2009. Saudi Arabia is now China's biggest source of oil, and the kingdom delivers more oil to China than it does to the United States. Once Saudi Arabia began stepping up oil deliveries to China, Beijing began urging Iran to take seriously Western proposals for ways to end the nuclear standoff. On May 3rd, Bloomberg reported Iran's domestic wheat consumption is expected to drop 6.4 million tons in the current Iranian year from 8.7 million the previous year, following a cut in subsidies in December, according to Deputy Commerce Minister Hamid Ali-Khani. The government paid some 40 trillion rials, about $3.8 billion, a year in bread subsidies, Ali Khani said, according to a Tehran-based newspaper. The start of a 5-year plan to phase out subsidies, including those on wheat, will increase competitiveness in flour and bread production and reduce bread waste, he said. On May 3rd, Reuters reported that the agreed-upon $513 million takeover of South Korea's Daewoo Electronics by Iran's Entechab Industrial Group is at risk of collapse as the buyer continues to fail to meet extended deadlines to file acquisition funding plans, a leading shareholder said on Tuesday. An official at Woori Bank, which represents creditors turned shareholders of the unlisted Korean firm, said they were now aiming to close the deal by the end of the month, but declined to comment whether they'll start talks with reserve bidder should the deal falter. The unlisted Iranian appliance maker was named preferred bidder for Daewoo last year, beating out rival bidder Swedish electronic firm Electrolux, but it has repeatedly failed to satisfy creditor demands for detailed funding plans, resulting in several more months of delay in the final agreement than it had initially planned. On May 3rd, Reuters reported the U.S. Treasury Department is close to a decision on blacklisting several foreign banks for defying sanctions against Iran, a senior Treasury official said on Tuesday, as lawmakers voiced concerns about weak enforcement of an Iran sanctions law passed last year. David Cohen, nominated to be Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes, told senators that he will vigorously enforce the new law. So far, no banks outside of Iran have been sanctioned under it. The law, which implements UN-mandated sanctions and aims to cut off funds that could support Iran's nuclear program, effectively requires banks to choose between dealing with the U.S.-led financial system or doing business with Iran. Cohen said the law has deterred many foreign banks from dealing with blacklisted Iranian institutions, but some are continuing to do so, and Treasury is focused on finding them. Our first option is to get them to stop, Cohen told a Senate Banking Committee hearing on his nomination. Our second best option is to apply sanctions. Without getting into the details of any particular investigation, we are getting close to a decision point on several institutions. On May 3rd, Reuters reported that Iran, which was long dependent on imported gasoline for 30 to 40% of its consumption, said last year that it had started exporting the fuel. We plan to export 3 to 3.5 million liters of gasoline per day by the end of the current Iranian year, energy official Jalil Salari told the IRNA news agency. In regards to the conditions of supply and demand in the market, we plan to increase our gasoline exports, he added. Traders expressed skepticism over the sustainability of the increase after Iran's announcement in September that it had achieved self-sufficiency in gasoline production in an emergency plan after sanctions had stopped many companies from selling to Iran. Converting petrochemical plants to gasoline production has been the main way of boosting production in Iran. Iran has been forced to import due to a lack of sufficient refining capacity, an economic weak spot deliberately targeted by sanctions over Iran's disputed atomic work. Salari also said that Iran was currently exporting gasoline to neighboring Iraq and Afghanistan. In early May, AFP reported a congressional panel released a report that alleges that Iran's elite Quds Force offers support to al-Qaeda, adding a new dimension to the militant threat to the United States. In its report to the Congressional Anti-Terrorism Caucus, the strategic advisory firm Kronos highlighted what it said are increasingly strong links between the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and al-Qaeda. The report was released by the caucus after U.S. troops killed Osama bin Laden in a raid on Pakistan that raised fresh doubts about Pakistan's willingness or ability to track down al-Qaeda suspects. Iran has quietly forged a strong working relationship with core al-Qaeda leaders, said the report's author, Michael S. Smith II. This relationship has been established to counter American influence in the Middle East and South Asia, according to his report. Through it, Iran will likely also help al-Qaeda mobilize terrorists to carry out attacks against the U.S. and our allies, providing the support required to extend al-Qaeda's operational reach, the report added. Smith argued that not enough attention has been paid to the links between the two entities because of a pervasive belief that Shiite and non-Arab Iran will not work with the Sunni Arab militants of al-Qaeda. The ties date back to the 1990s when al-Quds members worked with the Iranian-backed Hezbollah to train and equip bin Laden's holy warriors. He cites the 9/11 Commission report for operational linkages between the two. Since 9/11, these partnerships have become all the more pronounced. Hundreds of al-Qaeda members, along with the family members of core al-Qaeda leaders like Osama bin Laden, have found refuge inside Iran, he wrote. In appealing for U.S. policymakers to address the links, Smith warned that, quote, if left unchecked, Iran's relationship with al-Qaeda could cost America and our allies dearly, unquote. The Congressional Caucus's Andy Polk said in an email to AFP that with the death of bin Laden and with Iran's Quds Force being listed as part of the new sanctions against Syria, this is an interesting and timely report. Smith told AFP that a member of the House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence indicated there is a, quote, mounting interest, unquote, in the apparent links between al-Quds and al-Qaeda. The member, who he did not name, suggested that Kronos could help by presenting a report about that relationship based on open-source materials, one that could be discussed with intelligence and defense officials. Later, he said a caucus representative contacted him and offered to distribute such a report to the nearly 100 members of Congress affiliated with the ATC. On 5 May, Reuters reported that Iran imported nearly 50,000 barrels per day of gasoline in March and in April, industry sources told Reuters, much of it from Asia, as the Islamic Republic kept up its practice of dodging Western sanctions. 5 vessels carrying a total of 1.5 million barrels of gasoline were shipped from Asia in March, a senior trading source said. In total, imports for the month were more than 48,500 barrels per day. In April, Iran bought 49,400 barrels per day, according to shipping documents that showed a further 5 cargoes carrying a total of 1.4 million barrels. 3 of them involved ship-to-ship transfers in the Strait of Hormuz. When we talk about Iranian imports, about 5 cargoes per month is the number we keep hearing, one Gulf-based trader said. I guess the main question is, where is it coming from? Until U.S.-led sanctions scared off many of Iran's regular suppliers, it was importing some 13 to 15 cargoes of gasoline. Now, traders say, it depends for supplies on various friendly powers, such as China, which has avoided siding too closely with the West in its dispute over Tehran's nuclear program. China signed up to the United Nations sanctions when they took full effect in mid-2010, but refused to support measures that targeted Iran's oil and gas sector. Other nations that could still be willing to do business with Iran include Venezuela and Russia. Russia in February opposed imposing more sanctions on Iran. Traders say they have received gasoline inquiries from little-known, smaller trading companies based in the United Arab Emirates and in the Gulf with specifications matching Iran's gasoline requirements. We hear some of those cargoes have ended up in Bandar Abbas, another trader said. There is no way to control this flow. The Islamic Republic has boosted domestic output and curbed domestic demand by reducing subsidies and raising pump prices, but the trade patterns imply it is not yet self-sufficient, even though it has made some attempts to export refined products. On 5 May, UPI reported that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has widened its ever-expanding economic power with a no-tender contract from the oil ministry to develop 2 big natural gas fields in southern Fars province. Even before the April 30 award, the IRGC's engineering and construction arm, Khatam ol-Anbiya, was the largest contractor of government projects in Iran and has become a massive business conglomerate that is independent of state regulation. Within Iran, and increasingly in Iran's external trade, the IRGC is an economic powerhouse, says Ali Al-Faneh, an Iranian analyst. The Islamic Republic, once governed by the Shiite clergy and guarded by the IRGC, is developing into an economy dominated by the military. The IRGC, formed by Ayatollah Khomeini in May 1979 to protect the infant Islamic Republic, became the most powerful military force in Iran. It also dominates the arms industry, including the development and production of ballistic missiles like the Shahab 3B, and has operational control of the nation's strategic missile forces. Khatam al-Anbiya got a major boost last June when the United Nations, along with the United States and the European Union, imposed tight economic sanctions on Iran for its refusal to abandon its contentious nuclear program. The Guard Corps, a major target of the sanctions because of its growing economic clout, exploited the punitive measures taken against it by assuming a major role in developing Iran's oil sector. The Islamic Republic has oil reserves of 150 billion barrels, the third largest in the world. Its natural gas reserves are pegged at 948 trillion cubic feet, second only to Russia. The Revolutionary Guard's engineering companies replaced Europeans driven off by sanctions and were given huge no-bid contracts, greatly enhancing its economic power. This, when combined with the political clout the IRGC has amassed in recent years, particularly under hardline President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a Guards commander in the 1980-88 war with Iraq, gives the IRGC immense power in Iran. In June 2006, the Revolutionary Guards were put in charge of developing the giant offshore South Pars gas fields in the southern Persian Gulf, a contract also awarded without it being put out to tender. South Pars is the world's largest gas field, with reserves estimated at 1,800 trillion cubic feet of gas. At the time, several members of Iran's Majlis demanded an inquiry into how the contract was awarded. Government spokesman Gholam Hossein Elham defended the project. No inquiry occurred then or since. The IRGC now interprets its operational freedom so broadly that it accepts no constitutional restrictions, Alphonse said. In effect, as long as the supreme leader supports the IRGC, any action it takes is legal. In July 2006, Khatam al-Anbiya expanded its influence in the oil and gas sector by assuming ownership of public enterprises that included Oriental Kish Company, a drilling outfit sometimes known as Oriental Oil. IRGC involvement changed Oriental Kish operations, Alphonse noted in a recent paper. It resolved a commercial dispute with the Romanian-owned group Servicii Petroliere by firing on Romanian workers from both military helicopters and ships before boarding the offshore Romanian rig and holding its crew hostage. The Revolutionary Guards also muscled its way into the telecommunications business. In February 2002, the IRGC-operated Iran Electronics Industries forced the government to cancel a second mobile phone network set up by a Turkish company, Turkcell, which the government had approved. Alleging that letting the Turks in would compromise national security, the Guards took over the contract themselves. In September 2009, the IRGC-linked Etemad-e-Mobin consortium bought a majority share in the state-run Iranian telecommunications company for $7.8 billion. That brought the strategic sector under the control of the Revolutionary Guards. The Guard Corps has also moved heavily into Iran's underground economy. Mehdi Karoubi, a former parliamentary speaker who heads the so-called Green Opposition, alleges the IRGC operates 60 invisible jetties along the south coast for illegal import and export activities. Critics claim that one-third of Iran's imports enter the country illegally, usually courtesy of the IRGC. One lawmaker estimated the IRGC made around $12 billion a year from smuggling. And that concludes the news roundup for this week. Please send your questions and comments on any of the above stories to IranThisWeek@artkeller.com. And now it's time for questions and comments from the desk of Art Keller. In this week's news reports, we heard from official regime news outlets that not only is Iran self-sufficient in gasoline, it is actually on track to export 3.5 million liters next year. A report immediately contradicted by a detailed Reuters news story explaining that Iran's claims of exporting gasoline are largely a sleight of hand trick and that Iran remains heavily dependent on gasoline imports. While I have no intention of allowing such egregious trickery to pass unremarked, it is also worth remembering that Iran's ideological foes often resort to shading the truth as well. Reports that the so-called strategic advisory group Kronos declared that Iran's Quds Force is helping al-Qaeda garnered a fair amount of press attention in a week in which Osama bin Laden was finally killed by U.S. forces. But when one digs deeper to find out about Kronos or the report's author, Michael S. Smith II, one finds precious little substance. As best as I can determine, Smith is a conservative activist and a self-described leader in the field of terrorism investigation. What qualifications he has to make such bold statements linking Quds Force to Al-Qaeda, and on what information he is basing that sensational report, remain largely a mystery to me. It is true that numerous Al-Qaeda members and their families have found refuge in Iran, but providing refuge to people being pursued by the U.S. is not proof that the Quds Force is actively funding, training, or arming Al-Qaeda. As with earlier claims that Saddam had links to Al-Qaeda, claims which proved to be the sheerest nonsense, until solid multi-source intelligence develops of collaboration between Al-Qaeda and the Quds Force, we cannot accept Smith's claims as anything than unproved speculation sprinkled with a smattering of facts. The last report in this week's news roundup on the cancerous spread of IRGC influence through Iran's economy does demonstrate one of the many sinister aspects of that organization. But Saddam's military and intelligence were also corrupt and had a finger in many pies in Iraq. I do not claim that the IRGC's Quds Force is definitely not involved with Al-Qaeda, merely that I'd like to see far more proof than Smith's report before I believe it definitely is involved with Al-Qaeda. And now on to this week's guest. This week, I'm joined on the podcast by the well-known Iranian political cartoonist Nikahang Kowsar. His work is syndicated by the New York Times and published on the reformist website Ruse Online. He's also the founder of the Khodnevis website, where he writes about current events in Iran. This is the first of a two-part discussion with Mr. Kowsar. Without further ado, here's part one of our talk. I went through doing a little research, a bunch of your cartoons, and I love political cartoons. They poke fun at serious subjects, which I think is a great way to look at them. And one of the ones that I saw from last year was interesting. It was the Poisonous Chalice cartoon, and it showed a crazed-looking Ahmadinejad, but his face was in the shape of a chalice, and the supreme leader was having to drink of that. What was in your mind when you were thinking of that cartoon?
The Poisonous Chalice refers to what Ayatollah Khomeini said in 1988 when he accepted the end of the war between Iran and Iraq after that famous resolution 597. And he said that he had to drink from a poisonous chalice to accept the end of the war. So we have this in our culture, that if anything is the cause of any trouble, we have to show it in a way that although it's poisonous, but we're accepting it. And I tried to show that Ayatollah Khamenei, by accepting Ahmadinejad as the winner and as the person who is somehow in charge of the country right now, has had to drink from the poisonous chalice. In the end, I wanted to say that accepting Ahmadinejad is a terrible thing.
Yeah, a lot of people would agree. In a related cartoon, I think, you have one of Ahmadinejad dancing with Flint Leverett, who's a well-known Iran analyst working at the New America Foundation. Now, Mr. Leverett wrote something for Politico.com. The title was Ahmadinejad Won, Get Over It, saying people underestimated his popular support and that he really did win. I take it you're not a big fan of that viewpoint.
No, I'm not. I don't like neither of the political parties in Iran, meaning the reformists or the Islamists, and I'm a critic of both of them in a way. But what I think Mr. Leverett was saying wasn't fair, because what we saw after the elections was that we saw hundreds of thousands of people went to the streets and were actually questioning the election. And probably just 30 to 40,000 followers of Ahmadinejad went to support him after he won the election. So it doesn't sound right in a way.
Yeah.
Of course, it's hard to recount while you're out of the country, and the system doesn't allow you to do a recount. But when the regime didn't accept a legitimate recount, you could understand that there has been something wrong with the whole election. And when they say it's rigged, there are many reasons to believe that something wasn't legitimate.
Yeah, well, come, 2013, the only way to really give any legitimacy in my mind would be to actually allow in election monitors, although I don't see that happening at this point. Who knows? 2 years, things can change a lot.
Right.
Speaking of the reformers now, in 2003, you ran for Tehran's city council. Most Iran observers looking at Iran from the outside, they're only concerned with national issues. Were there any particular issues that you hoped to fix in Tehran city government?
Actually, I was running as an independent, and I started a small coalition called the Green Coalition. That was probably years before Mr. Mousavi created the Green movement. I'm a sort of environmentalist, and I studied geology in the University of Tehran. And because of the fear of the great earthquake that many are waiting for in Tehran, I believe that we should start this debate on fixing the city, strengthening the buildings and the roads and the structure of Tehran for that very big earthquake that we are waiting for, and we have been waiting for, I think, for decades. And I just wanted to push on this because I have some popularity inside Tehran, so I thought that I could use it to pass on the word and bring some attention to the public, but it didn't work because being independent is a little difficult because I wasn't a member of neither of the parties. On the other side, there was this talk that the city council elections in 2003 was also managed by the IRGC in a way that because they knew that people would somehow boycott the election. Then in the afternoon of the election day, more than 200,000 votes just came from many soldiers and many members of the military staff. This is what we heard then. Mm-hmm. That means everybody was waiting, let's say, to see the reformists get out of the ballots. But what happened was Abad Garan, the coalition that backed Ahmadinejad to become Tehran's mayor, actually won the 2003 election. And that was very weird. Nobody was waiting for that.
Huh. Looking from the outside, I would have thought that view. Earthquake preparedness is a fairly non-ideological subject. I guess it's hard to separate practical issues from ideology and politics.
Although many political activists try to actually run for office through the city council elections, but I didn't see it as a political action. To me, it was more the lives of millions of citizens was more important than just being a single member in the council. And in a way, I'm happy that I didn't win, but in another way, I'm still frustrated that many people do not pay attention to the big threat that's awaiting. And many people believe that would be probably Iran's most devastating national security problem in the future.
Yeah, I can see the frustration because if and when it hits, you don't want to be the person who's standing on the outside having to say, well, I told you so, because if you say it, you'll be saying it literally on the bodies of all the poor people who were killed because no one had the will or motivation to take action.
Exactly.
At the national level at that time, Khatami was still in power, but it seemed increasingly evident by then that he was more or less impotent to get any real reforms through. And of course, it all slipped away in 2005. Any thoughts on the Khatami presidency that the leaders of today's Green movement should keep in mind? Stuff that he tried and didn't work?
Actually, many of us believe that Khatami just wasted all the votes he had and all the support he had. Right now, we can see that how Ahmadinejad is somehow using his position to put pressure on the leader. This is what Khatami was not able to do at all, although he was from a different camp. But Ahmadinejad is from the same camp of the leader. And the other important thing is that President Khatami actually accepted all those ministers that Ayatollah Khamenei imposed on his cabinet, and even later people like Ayatollah Mahjarani said that he had been chosen by Ayatollah Khamenei, not by President Khatami. So it's very weird to say what even Mr. Khatami could have done while he was accepting whatever Ayatollah Khamenei was actually telling him or even suggesting. So he didn't stand as probably the voters wanted him to stand in front of the leader. And the other thing is that President Khatami is a follower of Ayatollah Khomeini. So if he talks about reform, he has a role model. So what kind of a role model would Ayatollah Khomeini be? I have no idea, but I don't want that kind of reform to happen. Because if it's the reform that we saw in the 1980s, tens of thousands of people were killed, we had a war, the government wasn't credible, did not answer to questions and respond to questions, and take responsibility for its own act, and we had the worst foreign policy ever. I don't know what kind of a role model could the first years of the revolution and Ayatollah Khomeini be for Mr. Khatami. On the other side, when Mr. Mir Hossein Mousavi actually wanted to run for presidency, and he said that he's looking for the golden era of Ayatollah Khomeini, that was very scary.
Yeah.
It was very scary, especially for me as a cartoonist, because I have a good memory. And I remember all those bad years, all those sad things that happened. I remember parents of executed activists in the 1980s saying people that Baha'is lost their loved ones. And that wasn't a very pleasant time. So I don't know what kind of golden era is Mr. Mir Hossein Mousavi talking about.
It raises a question to me. Was he saying that to try in and reach out to more conservative people? Or did he really actually believe that there had been some sort of golden era?
I think both. He gets his legitimacy from Ayatollah Khomeini because they know him as the prime minister of Imam. Because in 1985, when then President Khamenei wanted to get rid of him, Ayatollah Khomeini ordered him to have Amir Hossein Mousavi as his prime minister again.
Mm-hmm.
So actually Ayatollah Khamenei, who's now the leader, didn't have the will and power to get rid of Amir Hossein Mousavi in 1985 for a second cabinet.
I'm wondering if one of your recent cartoons showed a giant hand painting a kind of spiraling red line around Mousavi, with Mousavi standing at the center, suggesting that the red lines that the current regime doesn't want him to cross are growing ever more restrictive. And, of course, Mousavi's under house arrest now, more or less.
Right.
Do you think that by kind of stifling him and boxing him in ever more, that might help to convert him to the realization there is no golden era?
I wish he could have actually paid more attention, or probably he's trying to pay attention right now that we can say he's in custody in a way, although in his own house. It's a house arrest, but he can't get out. I hope he has enough time to pay attention to the past and review what's gone wrong in the past 32 years. If you see, even in that cartoon, he has had even times that he had more freedom. He could say more things, but now it's getting worse and worse. But he is the one who doesn't want to cross the line. That's the problem.
Oh, okay. That puts it in a whole different light. If he accepts those restrictions willingly, that's a whole different thing than being hemmed in.
Exactly. That's the thing. You see, the lines are on the ground, on the floor, but he doesn't cross those lines. He accepts them.
Which, in a way, is almost the same issue we were just referring to a moment ago about President Khatami. He was theoretically a reformer, but in practice, he didn't cross any lines.
No, and he let the system impose harsher restrictions on him because he believes in the system. And when he believes in the system and the supreme leader, based on the Constitution, can say anything and do anything, he's forceless, he's powerless. So based on that, I have all this I had a cartoon years ago, I think it was in 2004, that we don't have democracy, we have democracy in Iran. It's something crazy. You can't call it democracy. It's I think they have tried to translate it in a wrong way in Iran, and democracy has been lost in translation in my country.
Yeah. You know, what that actually brings me in mind of is under the Soviet Union, it was, of course, a one-party state, and they would say that they're perfectly democratic and that 99% of the people who voted for the Communist Party, forgetting to mention there was no other party, and that if you attempted to vote for anyone else, you got thrown in prison. So although it was probably worse in the Soviet times, even so, it's a similar kind of surreal thing where people are claiming one thing that just has no relation to actual reality. And along the lines of there being a surreal and crazy understanding, you famously got thrown in prison in 2003 for drawing a cartoon about a prominent Ayatollah Mesbayazdi,
right,
depicting him as a crocodile because that rhymed with his name, strangling a journalist, and them apparently not being too big on irony, they threw you in prison because of it, which more or less exactly reinforced the point your cartoon was making.
And just the only good thing was that because of actually showing how the crocodile is important for me, I've been wearing Lacoste since 2000. And I don't know why Lacoste is not sponsoring me.
They should.
I'm the only one who has been in trouble just for drawing a crocodile in the world, and they don't respect what I did. So I'm so sorry to face some people who don't understand the power of the crocodile and how it can outsell other brands in Iran.
It might be some marketing people are zoological hair splitters, and they say, well, actually, we have alligators, not crocodiles, on our shirt.
Right.
It could be that.
Probably, possibly.
Still, I mean, you got to be right. They're related species, and no one else is making an issue of the crocodile. Going along the lines of just kind of the weird absurdity of things, a year or two ago, I heard a story about another Iranian journalist, and this is not at all uncommon. It happens, unfortunately, all the time, but he was thrown into prison and compelled to do this whole production of a forced confession, including rehearsing it and all kinds of ridiculous things. But what struck me about that when he got to, it was either the U.S. or Canada, he related how his interrogators talked to him, and it was amazing to me how out of touch they were with things. They assumed that because he was essentially critical of the regime, that put him firmly in the camp of the West somehow, and that his life was a drug, sex, and rock and roll party. And
Right.
in the interrogator, he was asking questions that showed clearly what's it like to live like that. He had some kind of curiosity of what's it like to be a decadent Westerner, but at the same time, he thought he was really performing a service for Iran and for the regime by protecting against this tide of decadence that would otherwise, sweep away the revolution. And it just makes me wonder, from the religious conservative factions in there, what's the biggest way they're out of touch with reality about the way the rest of the world perceives them?
Can say that's the impact of ideology on the minds of all those people who have been brainwashed from day one. Basically, it's really hard to change their minds. In 2003, just a few months before leaving the country, one of my close friends was arrested and was in custody for 21 days, and they had interrogated him, and they had asked him many questions about me. And one of the things they had asked him, okay, does he pray? And he had said, yes, he does. Of course, I did those days. I don't do any. I'm a non-practicing Muslim. I call myself Muslim light.
Right.
3.5%. Those days, yes, I used to pray, but not in public. Something personal, and I ran a small company over there, and I didn't let people over there drink alcohol. I didn't let them smoke cigarettes. They had to be very professional at work. And they had also said, okay, how does he run his business? And everything was legal. But they had told my friend that Nikahang Kowsar is a half-Muslim, and half-Muslims are dangerous. They're more threatening than non-Muslims. And he had asked why. He said, because these guys can change the system.
Huh.
Yeah, because if a half-Muslim could become a sort of a role model in any way, what happens is that people who are following the 100% Muslims can say, okay, they can live differently and have no problems with a society, and they can perform their Islamic duties and then have fun as well. Not have fun by, let's say, drinking or going to the bar, no. But for those people, we were considered more dangerous for the system than non-Muslims.
In a way, I understand that, and it's almost very canny of them, because they're saying if there's a person out there who's a Muslim or a believer, but who also believes in secularism, that secularism has a place in running a democratic society, then that breaks our absolute control over everything. So
Right.
If you start eroding our control in one area, who knows what's going to happen? And actually, they realize what's going to happen is their control is going to start slipping, and eventually it will go away altogether. One of the things that I like about political cartoons is, of course, you get to draw attention to the absurd. And I'd like to get a sense from you, what are some of the more absurd or ironic things in Iranian domestic or international politics that don't get a lot of attention in the Western press? One recent example I was told was how Ayatollah Khomeini, the previous supreme leader, was saying that Iranians should be guaranteed basic utilities, and that with the recent slash in subsidies, a lot of people are now visiting his grave and dropping their gas bills there, saying, what happened to your promise? You take care of it.
We ran that story on our website. It was really hard to believe, but my sources said that it was true. And it says that all those promises and all those words were for nothing. A few days ago, I was talking to a friend, and he was comparing Khomeini's promises that actually, in an ironic way, people wanted everything to be free, and what he actually promised not to pay for any utility bills, and now people have to pay hundreds of thousands of tumans for just a simple gas utility bill, and they cannot afford it. And he was saying, look, 3 years ago, President Obama, or then Senator Obama, promised to get rid of Osama bin Laden. He did it. He was talking about health care. Okay, something happened in just 2.5 years.
Yeah.
It has been 32 years, and everything we see a reverse in almost anything that was promised. We wanted freedom. We do not have freedom. We wanted democracy. We have democracy. We don't have democracy. Even so many people believe that this is not even Islam. What is it? We don't know.
One of the last guests I talked to was talking about how there's actually fairly strong split within religious conservatives, and a lot of people are now saying this government, it's lost all legitimacy, it's overreached, It's way too intrusive. This is not the role that religion and really an Ayatollah was supposed to have. And they're not supposed to be dictating political things. They're supposed to be a religious leader, not a political leader who's compelling people to follow them.
Right.
Another one of your cartoons that I saw, and I'm assuming this was done in the wake of the 2009 elections, showed a whole bunch of remote control protesters with presumably Ahmadinejad pressing the button controlling them. I'm assuming that referred to Basiji and other people brought in to do counter protests after the 2009 elections.
This was, I think, in December of 2009, after the Ashura and Tasua, those days in Muharram, that many people actually went on the streets, and there were reports that the Tehran police had lost control of the city. And it was the very same day that thousands of protesters were shouting against Velayat al-Faqih and Ayatollah Khamenei. So just 3 days after Ashura, there was this organized demonstrations against the reformists. And they tried to overemphasize the importance of that. There were, I think, almost 30,000 to 50,000 demonstrators who actually were brought to Tehran, most of them bus. There were a lot of records of those buses in the streets. And one other funny thing was that they started actually handing them orange juice to the governmental demonstrators.
Uh-huh.
And that became a big joke because the main brand in Iran is Sandis. And after that, they call the Basiji protesters or anybody who participates in these sort of demonstrations Sandis khor, means somebody who drinks Sandis. Yeah, so that was, I think, the start of that Sandis-type demonstrations that were led by the government and followers of the government. The supporters were actually brought to Tehran, mostly.
That makes me think of an equivalent saying in English, of course, a reference to the horrible cult leader Jim Jones, who got a bunch of people to commit suicide by drinking poisoned Kool-Aid. That's common saying now. If you're buying into a crazy line of thought, then the shorthand of saying he's drinking the Kool-Aid, and that sounds like the Iranian equivalent of that. Tune in next week for the second part of my discussion with political cartoonist and journalist Nikahang Kowsar. Please send your questions and comments on the podcast to IranThisWeek@artkeller.com. That concludes the podcast for the week ending May 6, 2011. Goodbye and Khoda Hafez.